Hi, this is Paul, and I'm continuing on my commentary series on the Synod of the Christian Reformed Church. I know for some of my regular viewers, this is probably a frustration because first, my regular stuff was interrupted by the Quest for a Spiritual Life conference at the Crosspoint Church in Chino, California, and over the last week I've been pumping out all of that material, haven't done a lot of my own material, and now I'm doing all of this Christian Reformed Church Synod material, so I'm sorry about that. This is stuff that I am watching for work as well, and also I make these videos hopefully as a help to Christian Reformed people for whom Synod is a bit of a mystery. There are a lot of mysteries around this, but this is where a lot of the decisions made that shapes the Christian Reformed Church and shapes its future are made. And I know that even CRC ministers who watch this thing sometimes, to the degree that they watch it, they're not familiar with how Synod works. They're not familiar with any of them. Some of them just don't really care about it. This year there are a number of issues that pertain to the denomination. I've always been interested in this stuff. In my blog, Leading Church, before I got started on YouTube, I would comment on a lot of this stuff, and it's something that interests me, and hopefully I can help make the important aspects of it understandable to more people in the denomination so that more people can participate and really basically join the Christian Reformed Church. Now, one of the difficulties that a lot of people have, it used to be back in the day that when the Christian Reformed Synod started live streaming, they used a different website. Now they simply live stream on YouTube. What's difficult for a lot of people on YouTube is sort of knowing how to get around it. This is the Christian Reformed Church in North America's main page on the YouTube site. And once people learn that, they might subscribe. There's about 1,000 subscribers. I think a lot of people in the Christian Reformed Church just don't watch it this way or get to it from the denominational website. But if you go to YouTube and then you search CRCNA or Christian Reformed Church of North America and you click on the page, you'll get this, and suddenly you'll realize, wait, where's all the Synod stuff? Now, if you look on this line here, you see home, and then you see videos, and you still won't see a lot of stuff. Well, there's Saturday morning, but then if you go to the live tab here, oh, these are all of the these are some of the live recordings, and that's where you can more easily find some of the videos that are maybe a little bit a while ago, but not quite there. So that's where you can find them if it's not live. If it is live, you can look down in this subscription area and you can see other things other channels that you might be subscribed to. To subscribe to a page in YouTube, you first have to, if you have a Gmail account, or any other account, it works well with Gmail because YouTube is owned by Google or Alphabet Corporation. You log in, and then it will keep your subscriptions, and it will give you notifications, and it'll give you notifications when different sites are live. Now, the afternoon session just ended. They're breaking for dinner and for the Synod photo, and then they will have an evening session tonight. Synod was pretty busy today. They got through a fair amount of stuff. I want to highlight a few other things now for you. This is the site I used to do a lot of work with. I still keep leadingchurch.com as a place where I can sort of grab links and put things that I want. I don't put stuff that I necessarily endorse on my site. My site isn't really used to sort of popularize videos, but rather it's just a filing cabinet for me to grab stuff that I might be interested in and I might want to refer to back later. The advisory committee reports. So as I mentioned before, what happens at Synod is that big agenda goes to these advisory committees that's basically a Synod portioned out. If you followed today's plenary sessions carefully, you probably noted that there were some empty seats. That's because of some of the advisory committees have not finished their work. Now, you can see on this page, Synod 2023 documents, there are some things that are highlighted and some things that have gone cross through. And so if you click on something like Synodical Services 1A, this is the advisory committee report. So what happened was that massive agenda was apportioned to these different advisory committees. And you can see something of the structure of these advisory committees. Some of these advisory committees, like basically 1 through 6, are sort of standing advisory committees. Every year, Synod has Committee 1, Committee 2, Committee 3, Committee 4, Committee 5, Committee 6, and they usually have the same jobs each year, those advisory committees, even though they're not really standing committees in the Christian Reformed Church. Just in terms of the process of Synod, it's just easy to keep those sort of as standing committees. And then they add additional committees depending on what's on the agenda, how many overtures are there, to sort of divide all the work. So Committee 7 is Human Sexuality, and Committee 8 is Church Order 2. And they will be dealing with probably a lot of the issues, again, surrounding the 2022 Synod and some of the decisions made at that Synod. So if you click on a committee report, you'll see that, oh, look, here's an advisory committee. Derek Zile is the chair, and Neil Jaspers is the reporter. And they've already been on today, and they've run through a number of these things. And this is basically what comes before Synod, and then Synod acts on the advisory committee report. Now, things can get edited, things can get changed, but this is basically what Synod does, and that then will go into the Acts of Synod, ACTS, the Acts of Synod, which will be the record of all of the actions of what Synod has done. You'll notice that there's a definite formatting to this, and this formatting has sort of been standardized for a number of years. That way, if you're on a committee, you sort of get a template, and these are the decisions you have to make. Now, the committee can change things, but for the most part, they keep the formatting the same, so that when you read the agenda for Synod, then when you read the Acts of Synod, it all sort of flows through nicely. And it's fairly well organized, and the staff does a fair amount of work to try to keep all of this stuff organized. Okay, so I'm at the CRCNA YouTube site, and here's the home, and I'm going to go to live, and there is the Monday morning session that was this morning. And if I click on that, then we jump right in, and there's a little bit of buffer at first. I'm just going to mute it here. So you have opening worship, you'll have various messages, you'll have prayer, and I usually spend about a half hour or so and go through that, and then let's see. So first off this morning was the report from the Council of Delegates, the COD. One of the things that you very quickly realize at Synod is that there is an alphabet soup of denominational acronyms. And these shortcuts develop because everybody gets tired of saying Council of Delegates, Council of Delegates, Council of Delegates. So then they start using shorthand, COD, CRCNA. The Council of Delegates is the heir of the Board of Trustees. Years ago, the Christian Reformed Church, there were a number of agencies. There were sort of 5 main agencies under Synod, and all of those agencies had their own boards. Then there were also a number of denominational offices that were sort of alongside, and Synod sort of looked after all of these things. And then they had a thing called the Synodical Interim Committee. This was sort of parallel to what was happening at the classes. Each classis had a classical interim committee, and Synod had a synodical interim committee. And the purpose of these committees was to carry on the business of classis or Synod in between sessions. As the structure continued to grow and as things developed, increasingly there was a need for more continual oversight to happen between synods to carry out the work of Synod in between sessions of Synod. And so, was it in the 80s or 90s? I don't remember. I haven't looked this up. They developed what was called the Board of Trustees. Some people called it the Super Board. And the job of the Super Board was to sort of look after all of these agencies. Now, I was on the Structure Committee at last year's Synod, and one of the things that is seldom realized is that from an ecclesiastical point of view, from a church point of view, you have these agencies, and you have agencies, you have offices, you have assemblies. The assemblies are the local church council, the classis, and the synod. And they sort of are all mixed together and they sort of overlap in different ways. What there are also are corporations. And these corporations are beneath some of the agencies and institutions because the corporations, so ecclesiastically, that means with respect to the church perspective, the assemblies, the agencies, the boards are all living in the church land. But these corporations are living in the legal government sphere. For example, Calvin College has its own corporation, and that corporation interfaces with the legal and economic realities of the United States and the state of Michigan. Each of the different universities that are mentioned, like I said, Calvin College is an old habit. Each of the different universities all have their own legal incorporations that they use to relate to tax law, that they use to relate to all of the sort of legal things. There was a corporation that was the Christian Reformed Church, okay, that dealt with things in the United States, and that was Michigan Corp for years. And then there was a corporation in Canada, because you needed a separate Canadian organization to talk to and deal with Canadian tax authorities, Canadian government authorities. So you had Michigan Corp and Canada Corp. One of the things that happened last year was, and Andy was the chair of the Council of Delegates, was that the Christian Reformed Church added another corporation in Delaware, because that's often where it's easy to add a corporation. And so one of the things we did last year was clarify some of the corporations beneath the boards and agencies. Okay, back to the story of the Council of Delegates. So the Board of Trustees was dealing with the boards and agencies and also with the corporations. And there were a lot of questions about, well, how do the U.S. and Canadian things sort of line up and stack up? And that's what Synod 2022 did. And I think we did great work, and I think we very much dealt with some of the tensions that were below. That didn't get a lot of press last year because all of the press was on the human sexuality report. But a number of years ago, not very many years ago, people began to notice that this Board of Trustees seemed to have a lot of power, and it didn't seem terribly well connected to the churches. There were these regions, and Board of Trustees delegates were sent from the regions, but the regions weren't terribly ecclesiastical, and they weren't incredibly obvious to people in terms of why they had these regions. So one of the things that they did was they transitioned the Board of Trustees into the Council of Delegates. The Council of Delegates was much more ecclesiastical because each classis sends a delegate to that council. There were concerns about representation in a variety of ways. They had at-large representation to try to fill out some of those things. The Board of Trustees had equal representation between American and Canadian membership, but a lot of people pointed out, but the American church is so much larger than the Canadian church, so is that really fair? But then there were questions of, well, what about binationality? Is Canada getting short shrift? And so last year's Synod really sort of sorted all of that out, and there's a tremendous amount of detail in there that I won't go into, but last year sorted that out. Now, this is the chair of the Council of Delegates, and so he is giving Synod his report from the Council of Delegates. All of the decisions that the Council of Delegates makes are made, in a sense, in lieu of Synod. So at the end of the year, with respect to what's possible, and this is where things get complex because the Council of Delegates also has a relationship with these legal corporations that the Christian Reformed Church interfaces with the United States and Canada. So there's Michigan Corp and Delaware Corp and Canada Corp. The Board of Trustees also is sort of the legal representative and the legal board of these corporations, but it's divided. So the Canadian representation on the Council of Delegates are, generally speaking, the Canada Corp. And then you've got the American representations on the Council of Delegates, and there they tend to be Michigan Corp. And then Delaware Corp is kind of a different thing, but I'm not going to go into that. And that is actually still continuing to evolve and develop. And some of the issues that, if you listen carefully, you could sort of hear them teased every now and then in this conversation. That tends to do a little bit more with Delaware Corp. Delaware Corp tends to be more the office of the General Secretary. So if this stuff continues to evolve, and that's sort of the underworking of how to run this giant thing. I sometimes call it the Syboard. Why do I call it the Syboard? It's because it sounds a lot like cyborg, and because the church is an organic thing, and this is sort of an institutional thing that's supposed to support the organic church, but it also has kind of a corporate life to it, because it relates, it sort of interfaces between all of those. I call it Syboard because Sy is in synod and board is in board. It's not really a cyborg, but it kind of has resonance with that. So I listened to Andy's report, and we can listen to some of it now.
Reformed Church, responsible for overseeing and coordinating the ministries of our denomination. In this work, we enjoy the support and energy of denominational staff. We rely on them to carry out the work of our denomination's ministries, and we depend on our synodical office to ensure that the church enjoys ecclesiastical functions that exist in harmony with our confessions and doctrinal standards. They work tirelessly, obediently, and faithfully, and we owe them a debt of gratitude. They are committed personalities, and many of them have made their lives mission goals, beliefs, and positions of our beloved denomination in their life's work. We have thanked them and encouraged them often on your behalf. Over the past 12 months, the COD and the churches have lived under the shadow of Synod 2022. It was arguably an historic meeting, defined by the human sexuality and SALT reports.
Okay, when he says SALT reports, these are the reports where basically during the pandemic, there was a bit of a crisis about Canada has some different laws with respect to donations and international bodies. Canada wants to make sure that Canadian dollars are supervised by Canadian individuals. And so there were questions about, well, what is this? What is the structure of the Corporation of Canada underneath? Is this fair? And the SALT reports tried to deal with a bunch of this. That all went into Synod 2022, and Synod 2022, I think, set everything up. And then the board took over from what Synod 2022 had done. Part of what has happened over the last number of years, really ever since the Board of Trustees, as we play more synods sort of in operation, you very quickly see that there are a lot of issues that come up. And so it's very tempting for synod to basically say, oh, Board of Trustees, now, oh, Council of Delegates, this is what we want, you do the details. Okay. But once you delegate that away, you delegate the details. And as, again, we let some synod discussion around, you'll notice synodical candidates or synodical delegates are, in fact, sometimes very interested in the details. They care about the details. The details matter. And so on one hand, synod sometimes throws things over to the Council of Delegates, and on the other hand, looks at the Council of Delegates suspiciously and like, you seem to have all this power. Well, the Council of Delegates doesn't have any power that synod hasn't given them. And this is part of the tension of how this whole thing goes. So again, he says SALT reports, and I'm sure people will hear that and say, why are they talking about salt? Is it because there's so much snow in Michigan and Canada and they salt the roads? Is that the salt they're talking about? No, they're talking about binational structure and the attempt during the pandemic, because actually a number of issues rose during the pandemic because suddenly Synod wasn't meeting. And the Council of Delegates, which usually sort of has to manage things during the 1 year period between synods, now had to manage things for 3 years. And this was while there was all this anxiety about, are our corporations exactly in the right place? Do we have things set up correctly? Yada, yada, yada. So there was a lot of drama about that.
Council of Delegates has expended a lot of energy and thought to ensure that our actions were always in keeping with the decisions of Synod. and that they did not exceed our role or interfere with the ecclesiastical functions of the local church or assemblies.
Hence that line. He's reassuring Synod that we're your servant, we're doing what you say, and we're not getting out ahead of you.
And we have worked resolutely to implement each of the recommendations of the SALT report as approved by an act of Synod, and that work, as a result, is now complete. Our denominational ministry, of course, is much larger and endures beyond any one synodical event. We remind ourselves as COD that when Synod ends on the final session of the day, our work continues. Therefore, the Council of Delegates is tasked as part of its work as an interim of Synod.
Now, it's important to remember that the Council of Delegates are all volunteers. Nobody is paid to be on that council or that board. Now, some of those people on the board are ministers, and so they sort of get paid for going to denominational meetings. Many others are lay people. I believe Andy is a lay person. And if I'm incorrect, please correct me, but I believe that, if I recall correctly. And so these people are giving their time. And if you're on the Council of Delegates, it's not an insignificant amount of time. They will have 2-3 meetings. If you have subcommittees, there'll be more meetings. So it's a significant amount of work that they're doing. And again, they're not paid for this work.
To provide analysis and other feedback to Synod at every meeting. But before I do so quite specifically, let me comment on some administrative and ministry matters. I do trust that you as leaders read the Council of Delegate minutes highlights, which are available online. The Office of the General Secretary does a good job of summarizing our deliberations and decisions. It's not my intention to use this time to repeat what has already been made available. The SALT report spoke of culture and the need for cultural change in our denominational offices, agencies, and institutions. To that end, the COD and the denominational administrators have changed our in-house vocabulary. We've abandoned corporate speech and eliminated legal terminology when describing each other or the work of our denomination.
Do I still have this thing on fast? I was listening fast. Yeah, I do. So, well, maybe it's good. Maybe I'll keep them a little fast. Pro tip, Synod is a really good thing to listen to at speed. You can 1.5 or 2 if you're really savvy and you know some YouTube tricks and go faster than that. Because, again, there's a fair amount of tedium and you can kind of go through things. Now, a lot of the things that he's addressing were what our committee did last year, and this is kind of hard for a lot of people to listen to and understand because it's like, well, what's he talking about? He's talking about issues that a group of people over here are very concerned about, but that's probably only a small little group of people. And he's making the point that, well, we've done our work, we listened to you. One of the big points that our committee made last year is you need a thoroughgoing review of all of your labels. And so that there are a number of documents here. Let me show you another one. Not only does Synod give you this massive agenda, then right before Synod, they give you another massive supplement to the agenda. And then you get all this nomenclature like, okay, CRCNA leadership framework, governance type, synodical governments, governance authority, Council of Delegates, leadership office, Office of the General Secretary, executive leaders, General Secretary, Chief Administrator, Chief Administrative Officer. So you go through all of that language in a little while. Yeah, here it is. I noticed this morning. Now, the Canadian Ministry Office, U.S., one of the issues last year was there was sort of the CRC offices, and then there was Canada office. And a number of Canadians felt, well, why is there sort of CRC and then we're the exception? And they kept saying, well, that's nothing because the CRC is just the U.S. stuff. But the Canadians like, no, then it should be U.S. And so last year we did a lot of sorting of those labels. So you have, they wanted sort of parity on both sides. And so that people didn't say, oh, Canadian ministry is an extension of Christian Reformed ministry, because then they felt like just a little subgroup. They didn't feel like they were a partner. And so we changed a lot of the language. Then you have bylaw changes. These things happen. And again, you can, if you're really interested, you could drill down and you can get all nerdy on all of the stuff going on here. Oh yeah, here it is. Governance and organizational vocabulary, because part of what was difficult was that we're talking about office. And when you talk about office in the Christian Reformed Church, you might mean minister of the word, elder, deacon, commission, pastor. There's 4 offices, maybe, theological professor. But there are these offices in the Christian Reformed Church. But then you have offices in the Christian Reformed Church such as pastor church relations or safe church or social justice, all these other different offices. And so they've done some reworking of that. Now all of these church services are in an agency called Thrive. And so one of the things that, well, you're going to have to clean up what you mean by this word office. There's office and organization, and there's boards, and there's institutional boards. So then you have all of this nomenclature that you have joint agreements, and then you have JMAs, which are joint ministry agreements, and that is a specific understanding. You have ministry agencies, you have ministry boards, ministry organization, ministry offices. So all of that stuff. And now, mind you, this is a relatively small denomination that is relatively young. Poor Pastor Eric from Fargo is going to Washington, D.C., and he's going to spend months there learning canon law. So for the Roman Catholic Church, a far larger organization, a far longer lived organization that in fact had lawyers and such that, when sort of the Roman Empire falls apart, the Roman Catholic Church just sort of picks up and adds infrastructure to the world to sort of hold it up while the civil authorities are doing what they do with barbarians and Germanic tribes and who all knows what. But even just a small denomination like the Christian Reformed Church has to sort of know what it's talking about when it's using certain words.
We've chosen to instead use words that will strengthen our ecclesiastical identity and support our focus in our ministry. We have an Office of the General Secretary. The Canadian Corporation is now replaced with the term Canadian Ministry Organization or Board. We no longer speak about the Michigan or U.S. corporations, rather the U.S. Ministry Organization or Board. We have two administrative and ministry offices, the Canadian Ministry Office in Burlington and the U.S. Ministry Office in Grand Rapids. We have consciously moved away from a focus on legalities to emphasize service and leadership and our roles as ministers, the priestly and prophetic dimensions of our calling.
So that's part of, okay, we're going to clean up the language, because a big part of the fight last year, the second tier controversy, which was about binationality, a lot of that was because of nomenclature, because people who were working with this stuff were always thinking corporations, but nobody in the church was thinking corporations. They were thinking ecclesiastical structures, and so they've done a lot of work to sort of clean that up.
Our leadership council structure now includes a senior shepherding team, as well as management, administrative, and advancement councils. We work in groups. We work together. We take decisions together. And after listening to each other in settings where all are represented, gone are the days of sole executive decisions, where power was not shared, but tightly held in the hands of one or two. Instead, we work as partners, as groups, in a way that more closely resembles what we experience in our local congregations. Over the course of the
One of the things that tends to happen at this level of the church is that there are sort of organizational fads and fashions. For a while in the denomination in the 90s, there was sort of accountability requires directors, where specific, I was going to say offices, specific individuals in a particular administrative office might have a desk, and the buck stops there. And if it was always accountability, and then they had that for a while in some of the agencies, and then it was always broad stuff, and then it was groups of people are going to, and you tend to have these fads and fashions blow through the culture, and they also then sort of blow through the church, because people's expectations from the broader world then color their expectations of the church. And we're seeing that now with a whole bunch of new things, the power and privilege stuff, the code of conduct stuff. There's a dignity committee. As I mentioned, these things, the ecclesiastical stuff tends to endure much longer, and these other things in the Syboard usually kind of rise and fall depending on what's going on in the broader culture. Now, it's easy to get ecclesiastical types sort of get triggered by some of that stuff, and it's easy to get triggered by some of that stuff. But a lot of that other stuff just tends to come and go, and by even saying it this way, some people are offended because they're all excited about this stuff. And, well, fair enough, because these kinds of things are dealing with important matters such as accountability and fairness and all of those types of things. The difficulty with a lot of this is that when we talk about power, it's always a very nebulous thing. There are many different kinds of power. And usually what people do when they want to, let's say, address abuses of power is they invest other groups with power in order to address the abuses in other groups. And so sometimes that's a swing towards a lot of individual authority, and sometimes it's a swing towards more oligarchical authority, and sometimes it's a swing towards group authority. It's also helpful to know that the Christian Reformed Church pays a lot of attention to not having basically the ministers run the place. This is a reformational value. Part of the problem is that, for the most part, ministers go to every classis meeting. They go to synod more than lay people. They're always working in and on the institutions, and so they have a knowledge advantage of the institutions, which puts lay leaders at a disadvantage. So there's a lot of different ways that on these boards and agencies, the Christian Reformed Church tries to sort of balance ministerial positions and lay positions. So it's not just a bunch of ministers running the show. What that means, though, is that a lot of lay people bring their skills and expertise into these Syboards, and their expectations and demands and practices get reflected in these Syboards. And so again, when there's sort of a new administrative fashion or concern running through the culture, that gets brought into these institutions. And because, again, this is a Protestant church, there's always a demand to not let the ministers run away with things. Then there's tension that comes in. And for the most part, ministers' salaries are paid by all of the lay people, so ministers who don't listen to the lay people and in one way or another accommodate a lot of their concerns wind up as ex-ministers. I was watching all this morning, and so I wrote a little thing for Voices that nobody decided to respond to. It was entitled, "People Who Are Resistant to Abusive Power Efforts Fear Abuse of Power." This is one of the ironies of this situation, that what happens is that the ecclesiastical structure sets up new structures in order to try to keep the old structures in check. But the old structures were often set up themselves responding to past abuses of power of one form or another. It's sort of like the government that wrestles with corruption, naming a corruption czar to battle corruption, and everyone fearing that the new corruption czar is himself or herself corrupt. It continues to baffle me why we reach for a word like czar, because nothing communicates autocrat more than the word czar. Now, fortunately, in the Christian Reformed Church, we have not reached into that. I've seen that often in the United States government, and it's always funny, like, why are we in this democracy all excited about czars? Well, because a camel is a horse built by committee, as the saying often goes. So then we look for anti-czarist language for the new powerful individuals or committees that employ with extraordinary power in order to address abuse of power. All of this, of course, is to address the real or imagined abuses of power done by structures and systems of power we have given power to in order to effect change in this world. When we want to effect change, we give people or institutions or bodies power. All of this reshuffling is, of course, about trust. Hurt comes into this world, but trust can be endured if someone says that the hurt will be fruitful. Listening is helpful too. If you listen to John Van Donk's excellent Shino talk, you'll notice he emphasized listening in estuary meetings. Listening is the sneaky skill of estuary. It's a highly democratic process and community. And again, one of the things that you'll hear throughout Synod is listening, 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 listening. We want to listen, we want to listen. But listening is always in my video land, talking to John Vervaeke, who's a Canadian cognitive scientist, we talk about opponent processing. And now doing a lot of the thinking that I've done about opponent processing, there's a ton of opponent processing going on within the body of Synod and within the church and within just about any structure or extended body that we have in the world. We need to listen. We also need to act, because you can spend forever listening and never acting. And then suddenly, well, there's nobody listening and we're just acting, but then all sorts of people get hurt. And so it's always an opponent processing back and forth to try to keep these things in balance. Part of the irony of the new attempts to address power is that most often the methods are rather anti-democratic. This is a byproduct of the new systems critical mindset of the new ways of addressing past wrongs. The answer to abuses of monarchical or papal was democracy, divided power, distributed power. Have councils make decisions for church rather than individuals. Make sure there's plenty of lay people that are working on the structure and not just clergy. Finding failure, abuse, and corruption in systems have ironically led back to oligarchical or monarchical leadership mechanisms again. And so you'll see this tension, this opponent processing tension again and again and again through history. And so it's people then, what happens often is people react to sort of the new system of control to wring out corruption. Well, of course, they must be corrupt because they're against our corrupt, and they're against our new system, and this sets up all these Kafka traps that bureaucracies and institutions tend to develop. Structures are important, but there's no substitute for trust. Trust is the key.
Past year, we have noted that we're in a far better place as a culture. There's less tension, less anger, less offense, and instead there's an increased desire to work through problems together. SALT, in my humble opinion, has turned out to be a synodical home run.
Okay, so his opinion, they've implemented a lot of the stuff from last year, and they were feeling the tensions in the culture before, but the culture of the Council of Delegates, it's a happier group now. It seems to be humming better. Well, that's good.
Before I end this portion of my remarks, I feel a strong need to call attention to the tireless service of two members of our denomination who are largely responsible for the SALT model of partnership in the joint ministry agreement process. We're enjoying harmony and administrative efficiency today, largely because of the thoughtful work of Reverend Frederick Koning, our unpaid consultant, and Dr. Lloyd Vanderkwak, our interim CAO. They showed us the way forward and overcame our early skepticism. Frederick led us to Lloyd, and the Council of Delegates is so appreciative of Lloyd and all that he did to cement the implementation of the SALT model and the joint ministry agreements. Both men are sought after, and yet they interrupted their professional pursuits, donated their time generously, and in Lloyd's case came out of retirement to serve us in our U.S. ministry office.
So there you see, and these aren't even individuals that I know, but they're gifted individuals. They stepped forward, and they were able to do a lot of implementing for the Council of Delegates, and the chair of the council says this has been really good.
They both have national reputations and have helped several Christian charities and institutions change their administrative structures for the better. They have spent more than 1,000 hours in professional service to our denomination. They'll probably be upset or embarrassed for my having called them out today, but I believe they deserve at least some special recognition and public thanks, for truly they are servant leaders. For several decades, Synod has worked to promote diversity and inclusion. The more I'm in this work, the more I realize how necessary it is for church members and leaders to appreciate and understand one another. Christian Reformed synods have taken steps to combat racism, discrimination, and all forms of abuse. We have a strong desire, it seems, to address systemic racism, discrimination, and all forms of abuse, spiritual and otherwise. Our churches and members remind us that all people are to be welcomed and valued, and that desire shows up in the ways we choose to spend our resources and energy as a wider.
Part of the difficulty with a lot of this language is that people can get reactive about it. I remember some of the first language then gets sort of a valence, and then regardless of, say, what the Webster definition of a word is, people can get reactive to it. But if you listen to carefully, what he just said is that, on one hand, we want to be sensitive. We want to be sensitive to people. And this is an expectation that churches have. And people come in, people come with a variety of attributes and concerns, and you want to be sensitive to these attributes and concerns. But there's opponent processing with respect to this that says, all right, we want to be sensitive, but also the show must go on and things must happen, which means we make decisions, and decisions are always about a selection, and selection is always about exclusion. We decide to do this and not that. We decide to hire this person and not that person. We decide to invest our money here and not there. Every decision is about exclusion. I'm including this and I'm excluding that. You can't include everything, or you don't actually have any power. You just have sort of a static nothing. And so these are all the issues that you have with this kind of thing. Now, those were some of the main things that I was thinking of during this. We'll skip ahead. So next up was Zachary King. He's the new General Secretary. I was going to say Executive Director, because again, part of what, again, so you have the Cyborg or the Syboard, and it's always changing. And it's always changing partly because of that tendency of you have all of the lay involvement. You have all this cultural change. And the church, again, isn't unlike, again, a big point to the Protestant Reformation is the church isn't a group of clergy that are running it and everyone else is sort of around there doing what they say. This is a big difference in the Christian Reformed Church, and even when I was in the Dominican Republic, the Haitian pastors that we worked with would often have a saying, "No hay jefes en la reformada," which meant there aren't bosses in the Christian Reformed Church. Part of that was because in their Haitian culture, they had often a series of bosses, and the bosses were these little autocrats who would get things done. Now, obviously, autocracy works well for, at least to a degree, for the autocrat, but these more distributed systems of governments try to be a little bit more sensitive to those who are in some ways outside of the system. And in this little corner, that's sort of what we talk about when we talk about this little internet community. That's a different part from, let's say, how do I describe the relationship between myself and this little corner? It's a little hard, but these are some of the issues that are going on. Now, this is Zach King's first State of the Church attempt to do a State of the Church address. Let's see if I can get the slide up here. There we go. Now, this is something that started a number of years ago when we had. So when I talk about the church changing, the church used to have a general secretary. And the job of the general secretary was basically to keep all of the church order stuff and the ecclesiastical stuff, to keep all of those records tidy. And that was the job of the general secretary. And then we went to the board of trustees. And this was at the time of, okay, I got to be fair, I talked about the fashions in the business world. We should talk about the fashions in the ecclesiastical world. This was the time of the seeker church. And I remember, in fact, at one point interviewing, I think it was the same Chino church that we had our estuary meeting in. It wasn't Crosspoint at that point. It was before the URC split, if I recall correctly. And a lot of churches were playing with administrative models that were coming from the business world. And you would have senior pastors who would make decisions. And the elders, the senior pastor, basically every year could be fired by the elder board or something like that. But you had a very different internal church structure than what was traditional in the Christian Reformed Church. That was very much, traditionally, Christian Reformed churches are very much elder-led, sort of similar to the Presbyterian, or elders and deacons, depending on the size of the church and the particular nature of the church. And so when the Board of Trustees developed, they very much said, well, if we want this cyborg, now, again, this is different from the organic ecclesiastical, all of the churches, synod, classis, local churches. If we want these denominational agencies to really run well, we should take clues from the business world, because businesses look at large organizations and learn how to really run well. So at that point in the denomination, we had all of these directors. It was the director of this, the director of that, the director of this, director of that. Everybody knew who they had to report to. That whole chain of command, all of these directors. So at the top of the heap, we had an executive director of the Christian Reformed Church. Now, in the last round of restructuring, they changed it again, and they added a new corporation, which was separate from the Michigan Corp, which is sort of the corporation beneath the Syboard. I should draw a picture for this because it gets complicated. Of the United States, the part of the denomination that's the United States. Sometimes I talk about big D, little d denomination. The denomination are the family of Christian Reformed churches in the United States and Canada. We'll have to talk about Venezuela at some point, because I've got thoughts about that. And then, okay, so then you have these denominational agencies. And the denominational agencies are under the Super Board. And now they're under the Council of Delegates. But they've also got these corporations underneath. And so you're watching all of that. So then they added a new corporation called, in Delaware, and this is sort of an intermediary between the two. So you have the United States, you have Canada, and then you have sort of this ecclesiastical organism that ties to it. If you want to see a bunch of pretty pictures, you can rummage through all the Council of Delegates stuff, and you'll find all kinds of pictures trying to diagram this. And again, in our committee last year, we were drawing all kinds of pictures. How can we communicate this to Synod so that the Canadians will see they're equal partners, even if they're smaller than the United States? And this is part of you'll hear little intimations here and there that some of the people have ambitions for the Christian Reformed Church not being just a binational church, but a multinational church. Yeah, that'll be another conversation. Because on one hand, if you're not necessarily flourishing in the United States and Canada, it's really attractive to sort of easily pick up groups in other nations so your numbers can look impressive. But the reason you keep numbers is because hopefully those numbers will tell you something about health and flourishing and performance. So back when we had the executive director, we began this practice of the State of the Church address. And I thought it was a perfectly fine address. These speeches are difficult because, on one hand, they've got to be honest. And to be honest about the state of the Christian Reformed Church right now means the Christian Reformed Church has a lot of challenges. And I've talked about those challenges in previous videos about the Christian Reformed Church. On the other hand, if you go there saying all is lost, then you're Denethor in the Lord of the Rings, the Return of the King movie, and you can't do that. That's not leadership either. So you've got to figure out how to strike a balance. And it isn't really a balance. You have to talk about the strengths and you have to talk about the weaknesses or the challenges. And I thought he did a pretty good job with that. The denomination has a ministry plan. Cultivate practices of prayer, spiritual disciplines, listening to the voice of every generation, growing in unity and diversity, sharing the gospel, living it missionally, planting new churches. And then it uses these things to sort of say, well, how are we doing on all of these things? And so he runs through that. And he talks about some of the things that the denomination is doing and talks about certain events that happened and disruption challenges, fewer adult baptisms or conversions. Low scores, and my congregation is involved in the birth of the church. Again, there are a lot of influences outside the church that impact inside the church. And so during the Seeker days, there was home missions, which now it's been sort of folded into, combined with world missions into Resonate. Home missions really had a big effort at church planting, and that has really cooled in a lot of ways. And so it's my opinion that churches, if they want to have a future, really need to keep planting churches, and that needs to be a priority of the church because it's extraordinarily difficult and it's extraordinarily expensive. But Tim Keller's opinion was part of the reason that the main line was in such sharp decline is that they stopped planting churches, whereas evangelical churches and to some degree immigrant churches have continued planting churches. One of the things that I think the Christian Reformed Church is going to, there's a significant portion where we'll deal with bivocational ministers, virtual church. Part of the strategy that the Christian Reformed Church has been having is to try to enfold, because the Dutch are neither sending new immigrants to the United States because their population numbers are not growing from Dutch reproduction, and those populations in the United States are no longer having big families. And so sort of as an organism, you look for growth, you look to immigrant groups and other groups to see, well, would you like to come in and be part of us? Now, if you look back at my wooden shoes video, a significant part of Christian Reformed identity has been this Dutch background. And I read Andy Kuyvenhoven's Time to Burn the Wooden Shoes, which was an article in November of 1980, which was kind of a watershed. One of the things that you'll hear again and again and again and again at Synod is diversity, diversity, diversity. But diversity only means something when there's unity. So you have to figure out, okay, what's diversity and what's unity? What are these diverse groups of people united by? And one of the things you'll hear again and again and again in Synod, and this is very common, it's our theology, our theology, our theology. Well, I'll tell you, out there on the street, we're not handing out, I was just looking for my big blue book of Berkhoff's systematic theology. Oh, you'd like to visit the Christian Reformed Church? Read this. So these are a lot of the issues that the Christian Reformed Church really has to sort through. What are we? What do we have anything distinct that we bring to the North American continent. And again, reading Andy Kuyvenhoven's article, well, our Reformed distinctiveness. Okay, what does that mean? Does it mean Oli Bolin and Willamina peppermints? My Hasidic Jewish friend from this little corner brings me and gives me this, and it's just sort of a joke. Well, you can hand out these on the corner too, but is this something you can really build a church around? And so these have been the issues of the Christian Reformed Church for a very long time. And because I'm always talking, I just have a ton of these Willamina Mints. I've got to start giving them out after church, I think. Or they're just not gonna be fresh. So then a lot of the rest of this morning's stuff was about boards and cleaning up some of that. And again, a lot of that when it comes to the advisory committees, their advisory committees can go through them pretty quickly. They can get to the floor of Senate early. Some of the other advisory committees, like Advisory Committee 7, they're skipping a lot of these plenary sessions actually and working on their stuff because that's a lot harder. And actually at the end of this session before dinner, I noted that Paul DeVries announced that Committee 7 majority is in this room at Heminga Hall and Committee 7 minority is in that room at Heminga Hall. This doesn't tell us much except that with an advisory committee, again, the goal is always to have one unified report. Well, if they've already realized they can't have a unified report and they have a majority and minority report, that says something about what's coming down the pike on the issue of human sexuality. So we will see what comes. Maybe I'll end this video here because I dealt a lot with the synodical Syboard stuff, and then with some subsequent videos I'll deal with some other things. So thanks for watching. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think.